So kill chains help us structure our planning and thinking around what security we need. Don't give anybody more access than they need, and make sure every time they access, they're properly authenticated. Hacking journeys take a lot longer than Hollywood movies make us believe. Hi, this is Carsten from Hacking Matters, where each week we discuss the opportunities hidden in cybersecurity. Hacking journeys take a lot longer than Hollywood movies make us believe. In movies, we often see how somebody breaks into a computer system and within minutes have achieved their objectives. That's almost never true in real life. Rather, hacking journeys take days, more likely weeks. The Simplified hacking kill chain describes in 3 easy steps what these days or weeks are spent on, so that you can appreciate what hackers actually struggle with, spend time on, and where you can make their life even harder. Today, we talk about a simplified hacking kill chain. Kill chains describe how hackers break into organizations targeting technology and sometimes people to meet their objectives. Kill chains are very important to think about what controls are needed in an organization. Because if you're introducing a new security control and it doesn't somehow disrupt the hacking kill chain, it's probably not necessary and you should focus on something else. So kill chains help us structure our planning and thinking around what security we need. When building hacking kill chains, people often err on the side of complexity, thinking of more and more things that the hackers could possibly do and creating these very large catalogs that ultimately don't help you think about security because you can't see the forest for all the trees anymore. These larger hacking nomenclatures are important in the more advanced steps of your planning, but for the beginning, you need to see the forest still. Today, we're defining a 3-step hacking kill chain where the hacker breaks into an organization, moves around in the organization, and then meets the objectives by either moving data out or encrypting the data inside. If you're looking for a more complex hacking kill chain, look, for instance, at MITRE ATT&CK, where there's hundreds of hacking methods available that can describe all kinds of hacking journey. Today, specifically, we look at something simpler. Let's look at the first phase of the simplified kill chain, the initial intrusion into the company. And there's multiple ways in which hackers can break into companies. We'll go over the 3 most common ones. First, finding vulnerabilities in exposed systems. If a company has a system on the internet, let's say a website, and there's a technical vulnerability, eventually hackers will find it and exploit it. Often hackers are opportunistic about how they find these vulnerabilities. They have tests for, let's say, a few hundred vulnerabilities, and they test those against thousands, if not millions of IP addresses on the internet. So they enumerate a huge space of possible vulnerabilities to sometimes get lucky and find individual instances. This activity is very loud, but you're basically hiding in the noise of the internet. You're getting packets sent from the internet unsolicited. You can block individual IP addresses, but there really isn't much in the way of blocking the hackers because they can cycle through different IP addresses, use VPNs and whatnot, and eventually find the vulnerabilities on your system. So important to note, the first phase can be very loud from the hackers because they have nothing to hide. Still, in the first step, trying to break into companies. Alternatively, they could target individuals, trying to social engineer individuals or put malware onto their systems. So that way they don't have to exploit a vulnerability that's exposed to the internet, but rather they get control over a computer that's on the inside of the network, some workstation, some laptop of an individual. There's different means to do this. Social engineering, malware, drive-by infection of vulnerabilities, but always the goal is now to exploit something that's already inside of the organization. Lastly, the third of the common ways to break into a company in the beginning is to come from a befriended company, a partner, a vendor, some supplier of some kind that is connected side to side to the company. So if one company is infected and they're connected to a bunch of other companies, those other companies also now have the hackers on the inside. There are many defense mechanisms to make the initial intrusion more difficult. On the internet, scanning for known vulnerabilities, make sure you don't have known vulnerabilities. Patch, harden your system, specifically the systems exposed to the internet, which is a much smaller subset of the entire IT estate. On the more endpoint-focused topics, phishing awareness, obviously, as well as endpoint hardening and monitoring, EDR or MDR systems are highly effective in especially keeping opportunistic hackers out who target a bunch of companies and are successful in the hacking journeys only in the weakest companies, and those tend to not have modern MDRs deployed. And finally, around partner networks. In today's day and age, you probably do not want to connect to any other company through site-to-site connectivity. Everything should go through the internet, through the standard security controls, and be based on the principle of zero trust. Don't give anybody more access than they need, and make sure every time they access, they're properly authenticated. Turning to the second phase of the hacking kill chain, lateral movement. This is once the hacker is inside an organization, moving between systems to find something of higher and higher interest until eventually, for instance, taking control of the entire organization, so they can then, in the third phase, encrypt everything. This second phase too is enabled through multiple tools in the hacker's tool set. And again, we want to go over two common ones. The first method for lateral movement is similar to the first method in initial intrusion, and that is exploitation of known vulnerabilities. The big difference is that you cannot loudly scan on the internal network. You can't hide in the internet noise anymore. You have to be very careful as the hacker as to what to scan and how many alarm bells you're willing to trigger. So you have to be a lot more selective about what to test for. You have to apply a lot more intuition about what vulnerabilities are likely to be present. As a counter, though, there are a lot more vulnerabilities present on the internal network. If you focus your patching and hardening efforts, for instance, to start on internet-exposed systems, that comes at the cost of neglecting other systems on the internal network that you believe are better protected from hackers. It's a similar exploitative activity, but this time as a stepping stone to go further and further into the network until you eventually find more and more interesting systems. But that is not the most common way for people to conduct lateral movement, which would be credential harvesting. Once you're sitting on a system, as a hacker, you often just wait for users to log in. And whenever they do that, you can steal their credentials. And sometimes somebody with higher privileges will log in, an admin user, a patch management process, any of those administrative tasks. You harvest more and more of these credentials, moving up towards higher and higher privileges in, for instance, an Active Directory, until eventually, after half a dozen iterations, you reach a domain controller, for instance, and now you control the entire network. Hackers prefer credential harvesting over exploitation of known vulnerabilities on the internal network because it does allow them to stay relatively stealthy. There isn't much that you actively send over the network that would be different from standard user traffic. And yet, if your detection systems are finely configured, of course, you will notice that somebody from an uncommon network segment, for instance, tries to contact the domain controller, or that users act outside of the normal times where they're acting. So there are ways of finding lateral movement, but they do require more advanced security controls than simply your baseline patching, hardening. In addition to observing hackers exploit systems on the internal network, you get an additional chance of detecting the activities based on the traffic that they're sending back home. These hacking journeys can take weeks, often waiting for credentials, for instance, trying these credentials slowly, one system at a time, not to raise any suspicions. So during that time, hackers have to basically put their own little viruses or control software to communicate back to their own system somewhere on the internet. And it is that traffic too that can be suspicious and can be detected. So if you don't catch them based on exploiting vulnerabilities or abusing credentials, you might still catch them based on the command and control traffic that their malware and the internal network communicates with their backend systems. Turning to the third step of the hacking kill chain, fulfilling the hacker's goals. Now that they have broken into the company and taken control over the parts that they need to fulfill their goals, those goals could be exfiltrating data, encrypting the data, or anything else. But let's focus on those two most common ones. Exfiltrating data. So the hacker will now start moving data from whatever databases or file share systems that have exploited onto the internet. Again, they're aware that monitoring could happen. and you should be aware of your capabilities around monitoring. It becomes a little bit of a cat and mouse game. How fast can a hacker move data out before they get detected and the exploitation becomes known and stopped? And this already leads us to your detection options. The amount of data exfiltrated is clearly one big indication. Often people do communicate regularly with the internet, but do not move entire databases out. So if your proxy servers or any other perimeter equipment sees large data transfers, that's certainly something to be suspicious of. Other indicators might help also in detecting. For instance, if data is directly sent from data store system rather than from end users, highly suspicious. If they're sent outside of business hours, if they're sent from user accounts that don't usually do that kind of activity, but happen to have been the hacking victim, again, between all of those, you should have a reasonable chance of stopping data transfers at least somewhere throughout. Now, this is already an incident scenario. Some data has gotten out, but at least you can become aware of the data leakage much earlier than would otherwise be the case and start preparing crisis response. Now, what if the hackers don't want to steal the data, but simply encrypt it and then ask you for a ransom payment to get your own data back? In this scenario, hackers are typically successful very quickly because large amounts of data can be encrypted in relatively short amount of time. And as long as endpoint detection controls have already been deactivated by a hacker, there's very little in terms of response that organizations can do. So in this scenario, really, your best defense is the backup that you can roll back to and recover the data that you would otherwise either lose or have to pay a ransom for. Real-world hacking journeys roughly follow this three-step approach. And so do we, for instance, when we conduct red team exercises. That's when a company invites us to break in to show them how it's done. And here we spend often several days, up to about 2 weeks on initial intrusion, then another 2 to up to 4 weeks on the lateral movement and securing the access for whatever data exfiltration, spying, or ransomware needs somebody had in mind. So real-world evidence suggests that hackers do follow this three-step approach. And so in your efforts to secure an organization, you should also think in terms of these 3 steps. And anything you're doing that doesn't slow down any one of these steps is probably not the most important thing you can be working on today. Hopefully this was insightful and also helpful in structuring our thinking around hacking journeys. If you have any feedback or questions, you know where they belong. And until then, happy hacking.